Nothing is scarier than staring into the eyes of a killer, and these killers were the most terrifying. First up is Kwame Govan. While you might think that this man getting dragged and pushed around in court is a nobody, he was responsible for gruesome murders. It started in February 2005 in Brooklyn, when Rashawn Brazel's body parts were found in bags inside a Brooklyn subway tunnel. The case went cold for 12 years, until the murder got linked to the last person he was seen with leaving a subway, Kwame Govan, who was imprisoned in Florida for armed robbery. Govan was sent back to NYC, and his DNA linked him to yet another murder, that of Scariest Thomas. The chaos around Govan followed him into court, where he had to literally be dragged inside and held down. Govan was being loud, uncooperative, and downright irritating.
I'm remanding you. I will see you tomorrow. By then you should be
that doesn't move. My chair's being, I can't breathe.
Govan was convinced he was being framed, but there was enough evidence to suggest Govan might have been a serial killer. With the trials facing complications due to Govan's refusal to be fingerprinted,
Mr. Govan's DNA was not on file until he was arrested and charged for a robbery in Florida. Once that became on file, that's why we were able to make the match from the Scariest Thomas homicide.
He was sentenced to 25 years to life for the Scariest Thomas murder, while the Rashawn Brazel murder trial is still in process.
This particular perpetrator has been all over the country. He's been in Florida, he's been in California. We will go forward with that. Any other case that might fit these parameters.
It's strange that these killers think just leaving dead bodies around wouldn't come back to them, as Demario Chandler also figured out the hard way. In Grand Rapids, Michigan, a body turned up after neighbors heard gunshots earlier in the day. The body was identified as Antonio Rodriguez Duarte. Police didn't have to look far for the killer, as they struck gold when they pulled Demario Chandler over for a traffic stop and found the smoking gun inside of his car. Chandler's arrest was only the first step towards more complications, though, as he claimed the victim was gang-affiliated and an illegal US resident. The police promptly ignored his suggestions, though, as anyone would with a murderer. Chandler had high hopes in a plea deal, however, thinking he would get a maximum of 25 years, but his hopes were crushed by a fair justice system, which gave him a maximum of 70 years. This sent Chandler into a frenzy in court, taking it out on the judge.
What the do you mean, dog? How the hands off?
You'd think getting out of prison would be a murderer's dream, but some of them are foolish enough to land themselves right back inside. Like Jermaine Wilburn. In Memphis, Tennessee, Jermaine Wilburn had just gotten out of federal prison, serving a 10-year sentence for armed bank robbery. Instead of trying to regain his life and rejoin society as a decent citizen, Jermaine decided to commit an even worse crime when he shot and killed Officer Sean Bolton at a traffic stop for his illegally parked car. Acting like a seasoned criminal, Wilburn fled the scene and carjacked another car. 2 days later, though, he must have realized the direness of the situation and turned himself in. His conscience didn't translate in court, however, as he exhibited poor behavior when the prosecution and Bolton's family refused to remove the death penalty possibility.
You can step back in the back.
The prosecutor was so shocked by Wilburn's actions that she spoke her mind a little bit too honestly in court.
Look at it, ladies and gentlemen. Look at the face of somebody that is filled with hatred. Look at the face of a coward.
Wilburn kept cursing up a storm, and his actions caused him to get kicked out of court. Nobody involved with the case was in support of Wilburn and his requests.
And given his attitude during the whole proceeding, it was clear that he was not a bit remorseful.
The jury, however, sympathized with Wilburn's family and especially his grandmother, taking off the death penalty and recommending life in prison instead. Wilburn was ultimately sentenced to 38 extra years on top of 25 years for a 2015 armed carjacking. Speaking of murderers landing themselves back in prison, Matthew Komrowski ruined his chance of any freedom. In Providence, Rhode Island, Matthew Komrowski had just been released from prison and even had a girlfriend whom he'd met inside. He was a free man with love in his life, but then he decided to ruin it all when he stabbed his girlfriend, Shriley Donnelly, and set her apartment on fire. No one in their right mind would have done what Komrowski did, and it seems like Komrowski himself might not have been in his right mind either, as the trial kept slowing down for competency hearings. Discussions over Komrowski's competency kept rising, and until 2018, doctors were still disagreeing over his state of mind. In court, however, Donnelly's ex-husband and his son didn't care what was going through Komrowski's head. All they cared about was getting revenge when they lunged over and attacked Komrowski, sending the court into chaos. What set the two off was Komrowski claiming that Donnelly's family would help with bail and attorney fees.
The chaos ensued after Komrowski told the judge the victim's family would help with bail and attorney's fees.
Yeah, I think their family is going to help me.
It also seemed like the murder wasn't on a whim, and that Komrowski had been abusive towards Donnelly for some time before.
He kept calling her, and I want you to get me this when I get out. I want you to get me that when I get out. I want a flat screen TV. I want a PlayStation. I want a Wii.
If Komrowski was evil for murdering his love, what would that make Tiffany Moss? In Lawrenceville, Georgia, Tiffany Moss lived with her non-biological daughter, Emily Moss, with her husband rarely home. Instead of caring for her child as they lived alone, however, Tiffany was abusive towards her, with a school nurse even reporting bruises on Imani's body. At one point, Moss admitted to beating Imani, and the 10-year-old child was taken from her for 6 months to live with her grandmother. But when she returned, Moss was even more vile and resentful, blaming Imani for losing her job. This began a period of horror where Imani starved and eventually suffered a seizure that made her unresponsive in 2018. Imani died weighing only 33 pounds, the average weight for a 3-year-old. In court, Moss came off as even more deluded and evil, laughing and smiling the whole time as if nothing had happened.
Can you tell me anything else without sort of letting the cat out of the bag?
Not really, Your Honor.
She made no statements and generally acted uncomforting, with some believing she'd done this to appear mentally ill to get a lighter sentence. It didn't work, however, as she was found guilty of all charges and was given the death penalty for malice murder, felony murder, child cruelty, and concealing death.
Verdict as to penalty, count 1, murder. We, the jury, recommend and fix the penalty as death. Signed and dated by the foreperson. Please give it to counsel for their review as to form, sir.
At this point, Tiffany Moss is the only female inmate on death row in all of Georgia. Child murder will forever be one of, if not the most horrendous types of murders, and Granville Richie took it to monstrous heights. In Tampa, Florida, Granville Richie suspiciously hung around Ebony Wiley and 9-year-old Felicia Williams. All three were at Richie's mother's house when Wiley left to buy marijuana, but upon coming back, Richie and Felicia were both gone. If only Richie had taken Felicia to buy candy or anything a child would appreciate. But the reality was far more grueling, as Felicia's body was found raped and murdered in the water. Richie was the obvious suspect, but racially driven discourse almost got him out of it. It was down to the prosecution's choice of words and manner that came off as insensitive to immigrants from Jamaica, as Richie was one. While the judges acknowledged the improperness of the comments, they still realized that there was a far greater evil at hand, and still found Granville Richie guilty of rape and murder of a 9-year-old, accepting the jury's recommendation for the death penalty.
The court has assigned an appropriate weight to each and finds that the aggravating factors found to exist heavily outweigh the mitigating circumstances presented. The court finds that the jury's recommendation to impose a death sentence is consistent with its verdict and is based on the evidence presented regarding the aggravating and mitigating circumstances.
The judge was notable in her handling of Richie's trial. She pretty much tore him down in the politest way possible, knowing she was sending him to his maker, whom she hoped Richie would pray to.
There will be no corporal redemption for you. And what I mean by that is of your physical being, your person. However, if you do ever pray to a higher power, either now or at some point before the date of your death is scheduled to occur, and you truly seek forgiveness and redemption for the sins and the crimes you have committed, I hope that you are granted it.
If these were monsters for killing 9-year-olds and 10-year-olds, what would that make a killer of a 5-month-old infant? In Louisville, Kentucky, Leon Montgomery and his girlfriend, Brittany Ballard, proved to be a couple of absolute evil when they kidnapped Ballard's 5-month-old son, Noah Jones. After 2 days, baby Noah tragically died from being beaten to death by Montgomery. The infant had broken ribs, fractures, and a fractured skull. What manner of human being can do this to a baby? One that isn't human at all. Montgomery was charged with manslaughter and the abuse of a child, but his actions in court proved he belonged behind those bars.
These injuries, how this child was treated, are just, it's absolutely inexcusable.
Montgomery was first held in contempt in the pretrial for swearing at an officer, and then he swore at the judge herself when she handed him his 30-year sentence.
And I'm menaced the Commonwealth.
Okay, you're in contempt again. You've already been held in You're in contempt again.
What y'all doing here is wrong to people.
When the judge denied Montgomery's request for a new trial, he went into a frenzy, probably envisioning his dark future and taking it out on the courtroom.
When you finish serving
I know 6 months, I got 30 years. Everybody here get
control yourself, I'm going to remove you from the courtroom.
He was held in contempt again and promptly kicked out of the courtroom, eventually racking up his sentence to 30 years and 8 months in contempt.
He, again, has shown zero respect for the law, no remorse for killing a child in this case, and there is absolutely no reason for the court to continue to tolerate the outburst.